Welcome, everybody, joining us in posterity for this call between Stephen Tellis, professor of government at Johns Hopkins, and Christian Fong, an assistant professor at the University of Michigan. And before we jump into the conversation about pathways into political science, pathways into academia from industry, and cutting edge questions and methods in political science, I just want to give a brief pitch for the institution putting on this conversation. And that is the Graduate Student Intellectual Diversity Initiative, GSIDI for short, co-hosted by Johns Hopkins University and the American Enterprise Institute. And GSIDI was founded with a belief that academia has an intellectual diversity problem, as it was increasingly evident to Steve, who co-directs it with Jenna Story, and myself. I'm the executive director, PhD student in history at Johns Hopkins. It was increasingly evident in the 2020s that on campus, regardless of our political persuasions, there was a serious kind of intellectual and institutional consequence for having so few voices on the center right in higher education, in the center even. And one consequence, I think, as we've sketched it out, is this phenomenon of field compression. A lot of the questions being asked in fields like political science, history, sociology, kind of narrowing the hypotheses that scholars consider narrowing as kind of political beliefs coalesce. And so this program was founded to help address that, to bring in prospective graduate students who are interested in questions, hypotheses, and approaches that might be labeled conservative, moderate, or heterodox liberal in their approach and their priors, and bring in students who are curious about careers in higher education broadly. And so in the first year of our operation, we kind of have two broad services for students. The first is calls like this, just bringing out information to students like you who are interested in graduate study in fields like political science. And the second and more intensive track is our mentorship program, in which students who are actively considering or applying to PhD programs in political science send us a brief dossier, brief application, basically fill out a questionnaire on our website. And we match you with 1 to 2 faculty mentors who have expertise in the areas you're interested in and who are well placed at elite PhD programs in the United States. And they basically help sharpen your application, give you a bit of a competitive edge, let's say, getting advice on how to formulate research questions better and how to take yourself more seriously as a prospective applicant. So those applications to join the GSIDI mentorship program will go live again this fall, probably around August. But until then, please keep tuning into calls like this, where we hear from experts like Christian Fong and ongoing conversations with our directors, Steve and Jenna. So with that, let me hand it over to Steve to kick off what should be a fun conversation with Christian and his plus one for the call today.
Yeah, I was saying actually, when I was doing some of the research for this article that came out of National Affairs on beyond academic sectarianism, one of the things that there's some questions on is one of the reasons why we have fewer people in the center and right is that there's concerns about the ability to have a family while you're pursuing an academic career. And the evidence of this very Zoom call is contrary to that. We have literally a data point sitting right on Christian's lap.
Yeah, no better job to be a dad.
There you go. There you go. It is true. You actually have more control of your schedule than in almost any other occupation. So I want to introduce Christian. So over the last year or so, I've gotten to know Christian's work really well and have been incredibly impressed with it. Christian is a expert in Congress at University of Michigan, so he is at the very pinnacle of the political science, or at least that's what the people at University of Michigan keep telling me, that this is the very pinnacle of our shared discipline. Christian got his PhD from Stanford. Before then, he got his undergraduate degree from a trade school in New Jersey that I've heard about, I believe, which we'll talk about in a second. And one of the things I wanted to talk to Christian about was his particular pathway into academia, because it's a little different than some of the other people that we've talked to. And so the beginning of this conversation is going to be very autobiographical. It's going to be one of those Christian Fong, this is your life kind of things. and then we'll talk about the particular part of political science that he's in, the kind of things, the questions that people are asking there, the kind of methods that they're using, the kind of preparation that they do. But before that, Christian, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself, even before you went to college? Tell us a little bit about where you're from and how you ended up at the beginning of this journey that's led you to becoming a professor at Michigan.
Yeah, so I grew up in Sacramento, California, and was got interested in history and in government probably eighth grade or so. One really nice thing about growing up in Sacramento is that a lot of people work in government. My dad didn't, and my mom didn't. My dad was a businessman. My mom worked in a hospital. But one of my neighbors ran the California State Personnel Board. So the summer after my sophomore year of high school, she offered me an internship to go work at the California State Personnel Board. And it was actually one of the coolest internships I've ever had. The job was that when a person applies to be a prison guard or a highway patrolman in the state of California, there are all sorts of things about their application that might get them just pulled out of the pool before they've even been reviewed. So, for example, if you have a felony conviction, that would pull you out of the pool. If you've lied on your application, that would pull you out of the pool. But this being the government, if you don't think that was fair, you have the right to appeal that decision to withhold your name from the pool. And those appeals went to me. And I would review the application and look at the relevant law and rules around it, and then submit written recommendations to a panel of judges about whether this appeal had merit and warranted closer consideration or whether this didn't seem to be a legitimate appeal. So that was my first exposure to like really the operations of government, and is a very important part of my journey because the people I worked with were very, very nice. But every day when my mom dropped me off at 9 in the morning because I couldn't drive, I was a sophomore. Uh, I was the first person there, or one of the first people there. Every day when my mom picked me up at 5 o'clock, I was one of the last people out. And the appeals that I was working on were from people who had applied to be prison guards. This was 2006, so 2003, 2002, who had applied years and years ago, or just logically, if they hadn't found another job already, they had much bigger problems than getting their corrections officer application reviewed. And the other element of this was that I thought I did a very good job, but I was unfortunately laid off after 2 weeks because that year the California state legislature failed to pass a budget on time, which triggered a government shutdown. And I asked, well, why does that have anything to do with me? You guys aren't paying me anything. But it turns out those are union rules. You have to let go of all temporary employees. So that was my first exposure, and that got me really interested in these questions about how to improve government efficiency that really informed what I ended up doing in college.
Yeah, and I actually think this is a useful thing for people who are thinking about going to graduate school that I'll give a little parallel. When I was an undergraduate, I was a journalist working at the very lowest point of the journalistic pecking order. I was working for like a newsletter that used to go to universities that were seeking federal scientific research grants. But as a consequence of that, I had to go and like talk to lots of people in agencies. And I learned something that I was going to get systematized by James Q. Wilson later on, which is I just saw a lot of variation in going to agencies, right? I had ones where, as you were suggesting, right, there were some people who maybe were not at the very pinnacle of commitment or competence. And then I saw people who were extraordinary in a way, like my parents had worked at kind of the elite track of the federal government in NASA, in National Science Foundation. People who could have been doing a lot of other things and were choosing to do this. And then people who seemed very unhappy to have anybody paying attention to what they were doing. And so that variation always, again, when I was looking at lots of later government political science models of bureaucracy, I was always running them through that kind of background. I was always trying to say I actually had something where I, as they say, where I touched grass. I'd actually seen reality, and I could compare people's models to the thing I'd actually seen. So one thing I think, even those Christians was only 2 weeks, right? I think that kind of experience, right up to the thing you're looking at, whether it's serving in, working in Congress or working as a journalist, anything like that is actually a hugely, and a hugely valuable thing. And I still draw lots of examples from things I saw then. Okay, so you worked or worked. We have to do the scare quotes for the state of California, and so then you went to college. Where'd you go?
I was a Princeton undergrad.
Ah, okay. I will avoid saying anything further negative about Princeton. So what did you major in Princeton?
I majored in operations research and financial engineering.
There you go. Okay, so that's a different, again, a lot of the people who we've been talking to so far have had a kind of humanities background or softer social science. But so a lot of them will not even know what operations research is. Can you explain for them briefly what that is? 'Cause I think that's going to become relevant to our conversation later on.
Yeah, operations research is a branch of applied mathematics that's concerned with running organizations efficiently. So, classic applications of operations research would be how to design airline routes to maximize an airline's profits, how to schedule when power stations are on to make sure that you never run out of power, but that you're not wasting capacity, how to design transportation networks. And then one that was very big at Princeton was also how to design efficient financial portfolios.
Right. So a lot of that is about, how do you make sense of a complex system? And government, of course, right, people have been interested in applying operations research to government for a very, very long time. People who are doing operations research at one point were also thinking about strategic bombing and how to organize strategic bombing. That was an
Right.
operations research. In fact, that was one of the earlier applications of operations research. And so, whereas a lot of the people who we've been involving in the program so far came into political science having read like political philosophy. You came in right with a kind of more mathematical understanding of how systems operate and to think about like lots of systems as having some common properties, whether or not it's in finance or in government or in industry. What did you what did you learn in doing operations research that's still sort of part of your mental apparatus that you use now?
Well, a lot of it was dumb luck. So to be good at operations research, you need to be really good at a few things. So the first is the mathematics of optimization, which is probably actually the thing that I use the least. The second is you have to be very good at statistics, and the third is that you have to be very good at programming. And this is a time when data science as a field was really in its infancy. Like the notion that people were going to go to college and train to be data scientists didn't exist yet. Like that was not a defined career path. But as it turns out, that's the exact set of skills that you would need to be a successful data scientist. And that's what I end up using pretty much every day.
Right. So then you might have gone to college and trained as an economist and done like econometrics, but a
Mm.
separate thing called data science that was not just a part of one of those other disciplines was not like a major thing. Whereas now, like there's lots of places where you can do an undergraduate degree in data science, but at the time it was pretty unusual. So at the time, again, a lot of the reason that people were doing what you were doing is they thought they were going to go into finance, right?
Mhm.
Was that the only thing? Is that would the people basically think the thing you were talking about was the pre-hedge fund degree program, or did people think about it as other things they might do with it?
There were occasionally people who went off and did other things that you might call operations researchy. I had a classmate who did sabermetrics for a baseball team. I have a different friend actually who went off, a guy named David Byler, who went off to be a data journalist for a series of publications that you would know, mostly about politics. But the vast majority of people were training for Wall Street high finance jobs.
Right. So you're at Princeton. How much while you were also doing this degree, were you still paying attention to politics, or had you kind of put that on the shelf at that point?
Oh no, I got into it because I wanted to use this to try to improve the efficiency of government bureaucracies. And one thing that was going on in parallel that's very important to the story is I wanted to learn how the most effective organizations in the world were organized and to figure out what were the things that they were doing that could be transported over to government. So I was using this operations toolkit to get myself a series of jobs in Silicon Valley. So the summer after my sophomore year, I guess sophomore year is just routinely a good year for me wherever I go. But the summer after my sophomore year, I got picked up by Facebook. It turns out that like having a background in advertising, which I did the summer after my freshman year, and statistics and programming is a super duper valuable skill set if you want to work at Facebook, but was not something that anyone was being trained to do. So I was just one of the only people they found who could do that, and got to really see how they did stuff. I worked at Palantir the summer after that, which is an organization that is still concerned with running government operations more efficiently than we were running them before. So politics was always like very much something that I wanted to use these tools for. The challenge was that was trying to bridge that gap. What was trying to get from, okay, here are things that work in private industry to, okay, now let's try using these things in government. I applied to a ton of internships in government, literally never heard anything from anyone, not from the CIA, not from Fannie Mae, which I thought should have been an easy one to get as a guy with trading and financial engineering, not from any of the executive departments, just nothing on any of those. And I tried to
What did
get,
that teach you? That's like, I mean, A, is your impression that that's the same now? And what did it teach you that people in finance and social media were super interested in you, and in industry, Palantir is more of an industrial, or it's a data industrial kind of
Mhm.
company. What was the lesson you drew at that point about the fact of that differential interest in your skill set?
Well, I learned that I found the answer maybe 6, 7 years later when we'll get to this part. Sorry, after I graduated from my PhD program, I spent some time on Capitol Hill. The problem was that I just totally didn't understand how government recruiting worked. I was under the impression that it worked like it worked at Facebook and like it worked at Palantir and like it worked at the banks where they have a big old stack of applications and they know kind of what they're looking for and they sift through the applications to find the people who have the skills that they want. They interview them to make sure they're not crazy and that they really know the stuff they claim to know and then they pick the best ones. As far as I know, that is not how any government hiring works ever. And I didn't have any kind of mentor to explain that to me. So I would just throw these applications in the board. This is something I kept doing throughout my entire career. So I remember the summer between college and graduate school, I emailed a bunch of campaigns and said, "Hey, I have this skill set that's being really useful in Silicon Valley for making decisions and allocating resources more efficiently. Oh, and by the way, the Democrats are using this stuff and they're cleaning your clocks with it. This is something that Silicon Valley would pay me $5,000 a month to do. I'll do it for you for free." And I was not able to get anybody to respond to my email. I think just because I understood so little about the nature of how recruitment works for these sorts of things.
Right. Okay, so you just to go on, so you graduate from Princeton and then you go to work for.
I went straight to graduate school at Princeton.
Oh, you went right. I mean, no, after Princeton. Wait, so didn't you work for? I thought you were one of those jobs you did is you worked for a hedge fund at some point, didn't you?
No, I got close. So
Okay.
actually, I was interviewing at Bridgewater my senior
Oh, that's the
year,
story. Yeah. Okay.
which is a big time hedge fund, really cool and interesting company. And I remember they do the interviews in a bunch of rounds. Like so, the first round, like humanities people are great at, you just sit in a room and you debate. They just give the table a topic and you debate, and they just pick who they like as debaters. I think that's going to carry over into who's good at meetings. And then they bring you over to a hotel, and basically you talk to increasingly senior people where they just grill you about whatever they want to grill you about. Usually they present you with some sort of problem or scenario, and they just want to see how you talk through it. And I was going higher and higher up in the interviews. And then about four in, I just realized like, I don't want to do this. This is really taking me away from my core interest in government. I think what I really want to do is something that's going to have me thinking about politics all the time. A lot of people tell themselves this story that, oh, I'll go work in finance for 10 or 15 years and then I'll make a bunch of money and then I'll go into politics. And as I was trying to like convince myself of this story in the interviews, I just realized this is crazy. Why wouldn't I just do the job that I want to do right now? Why would I gate that behind 10 or 15 years of some job that I'm not as excited about?
Yeah, well, I think that's interesting because I mean now we're going to get you into Stanford in a second, but that a lot of people, especially people, kids today. Now I'm going to say a kids today thing, which is a little embarrassing, but kids today often kind of let the meritocratic system push them along, and they do whatever the
Mhm.
next most seemingly prestigious thing to do is in the process. They're like, oh, I got to college. I went to the most prestigious place that the system sent me to. And now it seems like everybody's going into finance and consulting, so I'll let the system like push me, there. And it sounds like you actually had a relatively clear idea of what you wanted to use your kind of aptitude and skills for, and that caused you to somewhat deviate from the thing that the overall structure of our political economy was directing you to. Okay, so
Yeah,
tell me
and
about
if I could just
Stanford.
chime in like a couple sentences on that, because it's a conversation I
Okay.
have with my students all the time, and I think it's just worth talking about for anyone who wants to hear about it. If you're a bright kid, chances are your parents are your whole life telling you about the importance of working hard so you can keep your options open, so you'll have more opportunities in the future. The problem that kids like that tend to have is they get to college and they don't want to commit to doing any one thing because that means they're committing to not doing a bunch of other things with their life. And if you maintain that attitude forever, you're inevitably going to end up in management consulting or corporate finance, right? Because those industries, their whole HR structure is designed to prey on that thing. It's like, okay, we're going to give you something prestigious and something that will set you up for great things afterwards. But when I think about the people I know who have been the most successful in their lives and who've done the kinds of things that I'd be proud to do, they are people who were willing to make choices that foreclosed a lot of ways their lives could have gone in the interest of pursuing the one thing they were really
Yeah.
excited about. And that's what I try to do.
And I'll also say, I'm not sure how much in practice, I mean, there's some big things that foreclose stuff. Like if you wanted to become a like, particle physics, and you didn't go and get a PhD in physics, there's not a lot of jobs for people like that who haven't gotten a PhD in physics. There are things like that. But my experience is there's a lot more people who go through their careers and kind of tack, right? They go all in one thing and kind of see where that goes, and then they switch to often, quite substantially to another thing or another opportunity presents itself. But the reason they're doing that isn't because they just kept like there was some resource there that they want to make sure they didn't draw down.
Mhm.
That's the thing about sort of foreclosing options. I'm not sure how much you foreclose options rather than do a bunch of interesting things and then opportunity, or also the world changes and it creates a kind of job where a job didn't exist, right? You were talking about it earlier, right? There were a lot of things where 5 years before, like nobody was looking for people who had the kind of skill set you did. And then the world changed and suddenly it had a lot of jobs that way. Okay. I want to talk about grad school because we want to get into this. So, you went to Stanford. You went into a very particular program at Stanford. You want to tell me about that?
Yeah, so I went to the Stanford Graduate School of Business's political economy program, which is different from the political science department. It's a different faculty, it's a different set of coursework, studies a lot of the same problems, but is a really special group that has a different way of looking at political science and a different take on how you ought to study it than just about anywhere else in the world.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about that because I think that's one of the things we're trying to do here is give people a sense of what are the different sort of parts of political science and how do people approach the study of political things in those. So tell us a little bit about that and how you see Stanford GSB's political economy program fitting into the rest of the discipline.
Yeah, so the GSB political economy program argues that we should study politics with the same set of tools and the same set of theoretical frameworks that we apply in economics. The implicit assumption is that of all the social sciences, the economists have made the most progress towards actually building generalizable theories of how the world works that are invariant to time and place and situation. And so if we want to make progress in understanding politics, our best bet is to adopt the good stuff out of economics and apply that to politics. So this includes things like econometrics, the use of game theoretic models to try to understand or to try to boil complicated political institutions down to their simplest and most important elements, and then also the application of the scientific method to repeatedly test those models we build against the data, figure out where they don't quite hold up, revise them, and iterate.
Right. So why was that A, do you think you really understood that's what GSB was doing when you applied to graduate school? Because that, if it
Yeah.
was, you were a lot more systematic than I was in my choice of graduate school.
So we have to back up a little bit to
Okay.
go to like how I got into academia in the first place. So I was trying, as I mentioned earlier, I was trying to get engineering professors and technologists interested in problems about government. I was just having absolutely zero success. I remember this conversation I had with one of my professors where he's like, "Yeah, I'd really like to take you on as a research assistant, but yeah, I'm not going to work on politics. Do you want to work on material science instead?" Not really. So I got frustrated. And emailed every single professor who taught a social science class at Princeton that was focused on statistics because I thought, okay, well, maybe these people would be more open to doing things the way that I think they ought to be done. And I got one response. It was from this guy named Kosuke Amai, who turns out to be, by pretty much anyone's count, the greatest statistician working in political science. And so he invited me to take his PhD classes, and then I did well in the PhD classes. So he invited me to collaborate with him on research projects, and eventually publish papers together. And that was my foray into academic political science. He was someone who really valued the skill set that I'd acquired studying engineering, and was giving me ways to use them to make progress on politics. MI is what people would call a political methodologist. So his job is to develop new statistical techniques to help people solve social science problems. Right, it's a guy who builds tools, someone who builds microscopes, and that's what I was training to be, and that's what I was applying to do in graduate school. And for every other PhD program I applied to, it's a political science program. I applied as a methodologist. I'm going to be one of these guys who makes new statistical tools. I also applied to Stanford GSB because I'd read this book by a guy named John Bender that was using uh, a very different kind of model to try to show people how politics works. These bounded rationality models I thought was really cool. I said, okay, well, I'm pretty technical and they look for technical people. Maybe this will be interesting. Who knows? And then when I got there, they know this, so I'm not going to embarrass them. The visit kind of sucked. When you apply to PhD programs, you get in, they fly you out and you talk with people. And the whole day I was thinking, this is really not the thing. I think I'm going to stay at Princeton. I'm going to keep working with Kosuke. Let me grab my baby real quick.
Okay.
Come on, dude. You're okay. You're okay. Okay, yeah, you can look at the computer. That's fun. Never
There
get to
you
look
go.
at screens. Um, but at the very end of the day, the last event on the schedule was this dinner. And this guy named Keith Crable sat next to me and pitched me on his vision of how political science ought to be done, which is this vision that I just articulated to you. It's the GSB way. And I had never heard of anyone talking about political science in this way. He explained it in a way that made it seem like we're not just kind of endlessly chasing like the latest fad. We're really trying to build this structure of knowledge that accumulates over time. And even if your individual contributions get forgotten, the progress that you made will still matter even after you're gone. This was just a really cool, really different way of looking at what we do as political scientists, what we do as any kind of scientist that I hadn't heard before. So by the end of that conversation, I was thinking, okay, I want to go here and spend more time with this guy.
Yeah, so I just for those of you kind of follow, as they say, following along on TV, I read Kriebel when I was in grad school. So I took a course with a guy named Larry Evans, who was then teaching our Congress class, even though he was teaching at William and Mary. And I hadn't gotten exposed to a lot of this. I'd been in a very political theory kind of adjacent part of political science, then learned a lot from it. But this was like my first exposure to a lot of, rational choice theory of Congress. And I read Information in Legislative Organization, which is this incredibly important sort of seminal work in Congress. And one of the things that Kriebel was doing was not just sort of taking from, economics is a huge field, but in particular taking from sort of some of the new institutionalism in yeah, that was going on in economics, thinking about Congress as an organization and drawing on economics of organization and all that for me was like totally new. I bought some of it. I didn't buy some other parts of it. But yeah, I mean, Kriebel, as you were saying, there was, and I had been exposed to people like this who were kind of evangelists, right? They
Mhm.
were people who, really thought they had seen something and they were out there trying to convert other people. Kriebel really was a seeker of converts. And
Mhm.
that, that's the kind of thing that often happens in a lot of disciplines, right? And people go to study with them because they inspired them with the idea that they were doing something, really powerful and fundamental. So I was trained, by Straussians, right? There was a period when Straussians were really thought that they had seen something and they were out there looking for, incredibly bright people who thought not just they were going to knock out a few articles, but that they might actually, they might actually change the world. They might change how everybody thinks about things, right?
Mhm.
So, how did you get into the exact thing? You're now known as a scholar of Congress. Was it just going there and working with Kriebel that got you into Congress, or did you know that you wanted to do Congress when you got into graduate school?
No, I tried like nine other things first. So I hadn't totally given up on this whole being a methodologist thing, and the thing that I was really interested in was what's called natural language processing, the use of computers to understand texts, which, for those of you guys who have been keeping score, turned out to be a pretty big deal.
Right.
Uh, I thought, I don't know if these tools are going anywhere. Why don't I study something different? One of many bad reads. I wrote my first year paper on race riots and how those provoke policy responses that diffuse across cities. I was studying like the riots from the 1960s. It had been a while since a big race riot had happened. And so my advisors convinced me, oh, there's not really a future in this. That was just before George Floyd. I wrote a paper that I never published on what eventually became known as filter bubbles. This idea that the algorithms used to sort content in social media, which I knew a lot about from working at Facebook, might lead people to have a distorted view of what the political world works. And I remember this. I was having lunch with a guy who I respect an awful lot, um, who convinced me that there was no future in filter bubbles. So I got out of that too. He's like, it's always going to be kind of a boutique
It
topic.
seems like you had a number of near misses on becoming incredibly wealthy. If
Yeah,
you
that's right.
just a
And
few choices, you'd be
of
living
all the things I could have
perennially
landed
now.
on, I landed on the United States Congress. And the way that happened is, I tried all these other things. I took Crable's class. It's the third in the sequence, so this is the last semester of my first year. And he has us write a paper. I didn't know anything about Congress, but I wrote the kernel of what eventually became our paper on limited obstruction as a term paper and got totally hooked. I'm a guy who I really enjoy board games. I really enjoy video games. I really enjoy card games. I really enjoy looking at closed systems and trying to find the loopholes to abuse them. And it turns out that's what congressional procedure is. This is what I do recreationally at like a high stakes professional level. And once I started looking at it that way, it became harder and harder for me to spend time thinking about other things.
I see. That's great. So again, I think maybe, I'm going to stop occasionally and like try and figure out the moral of the story, right? And again, that was also the true for me in grad school. I had a whole other first project, actually the dissertation stage that I thought I was going to be working on parties. Jim Caesar, who's in Virginia, was one of the people I've been studying with, and I was sure I was going to do that. And I actually got like as far as writing a couple chapters and just discovered that dissertation wouldn't write. And I ended up doing a dissertation on something else with Martha Durthick, who was a great student of federalism and bureaucracy, and like found that thing, right? So I tried, I dated a bunch of topics and eventually married one. But I think one of the general points, and this is relevant to your career before too, is People often have an idea of what they're going to do in graduate school when they go. And I always
Mhm.
tell people it's incredibly rare people actually write the dissertation on the thing they thought they were going to do in graduate school. And so if you're not exactly sure, right, often it's important to actually go. You were talking about like sometimes you just, don't leave your options open. You go and try something
Mhm.
and then at some point be willing to admit that maybe that isn't working. But you have to go and try it long enough to know. And so that's
Mhm.
what, okay, so then you're finally now at GSB, you did a three paper dissertation?
Three pretty closely related papers, yeah.
Right. So this is one thing that's actually important to know. So when back in the Neolithic era, when I was in graduate school, we, for the most part, didn't have three paper dissertations in political science, at least not in the part that I was. I think there were a few places, but it was much more uncommon. Very, very common in economics. The most common dissertation title is three
Essays and papers.
essays on X,
Yeah.
right? Whereas when I was in grad school, you were like, my dissertation is just a proto book. One day
Mhm.
it'll be a book, right? It's a draft, the first draft of a book. That's what people used to write back in my day. And there's still parts of political science where people do that, but it's gotten much more common that people write these dissertations that are really three papers that are well along their way to becoming publishable, right?
Mhm.
And that's especially true in more technical fields. It's less true in things like political theory
Yeah.
or people who do like American political development kind of stuff. So what's involved, just really quickly, just so people know what the kind of things they might do in grad school. Uh, what's involved in a three paper dissertation? And how is it different? And people might have an idea what writing a book might look like, but what does a three paper dissertation look like? Or a
Yeah.
close, cousin of it like you did.
Yeah, so the eponymous papers are self-contained publishable research papers. So I think the big distinction between a book dissertation and a three-paper dissertation is for a three-paper dissertation, each of your papers needs to stand alone as a significant contribution to human knowledge, and can't rely too heavily on the other parts of the dissertation uh, to make its case. So in my case, all three of my papers were about the intrinsic preference for reciprocity. I got really into human nature, and this was something that I wanted to explore, and that was a unifying theme. But one of the chapters was an empirical paper that showed, hey, members of Congress seem to have an intrinsic preference for reciprocity, just like the rest of us. One of them was a theory paper on parties that showed that, hey, if we use this intrinsic preference for reciprocity as an assumption in a model, then we can get uh, a I thought, better model of under what conditions do parties in Congress make their leaders really strong, and under what conditions do they deprive them of the tools that they would need to get a lot of things done. And then the third chapter or the third paper was looking at how we can use the preference for reciprocity to understand why Congress follows its own rules, given that Congress has the ability to change or violate any of its rules at any time by a simple majority vote. And a bunch of those rules specifically make it harder to do things as a majority. So why would a simple majority ever defer to rules when they didn't like what the rules were prescribing? And yeah, each of those papers got published independently. There was a big conversation actually within my committee about whether that ought to be published as a book. But what I ultimately landed on is that um, I don't want to write a book until I have an idea that cannot be expressed as papers. It's very nice to have these sort of incremental progress, right? Because the fast of those got published really fast, like within a year and a half of writing it, right? And the slowest took 3 or 4 years. And if you were writing a book, that would be a very long time to be uncertain about whether the stuff was taking and whether people were buying what you were selling. With a three-paper dissertation, you get much more rapid feedback about how things are going.
So, okay, you write this dissertation and you went on the job market.
Mhm.
What was that like?
It was fun.
What was fun? Tell just to give people a little bit of idea, like what does that look like? You send a
Yeah.
bunch of applications out, and then what happens?
Yeah, so you write at least one paper, that's the job market paper, that's the thing you show, okay, here's my case for why I'm a great guy and you ought to hire me. You get letters of recommendation from all of your advisors. You write some brief personal statements on what you're doing and why it's important. And then you send things out. And the schools, basically what every school will do is select like 3 to 5 candidates who they think are really interesting and fly them out for the day. And you'll spend most of the day meeting with different faculty members one-on-one. Sometimes they want to talk about their stuff, sometimes they want to talk about your stuff. And in the middle of the day, you will present your job market paper to the faculty and the grad students at that institution. Uh, and it went relatively well for me, so like maybe that's part of why I think it's fun. But I also think that academia in general can be a lonely job. Like the worst thing that can happen is when you work really hard on something and you think you've got something great and you never get to talk about it with anyone. For the job market, every time I went on a flyout, I got to be the center of attention for the entire day. And we spent a good chunk of the day talking about the things that I thought were interesting and what I think about them, which is not how it usually works when you're a professor. Yeah, usually you're
Right.
lucky to have like one conversation like that a week, if you're lucky, and maybe more like a month if you're more isolated. So I thought it was awesome. It was a ton of fun.
Right. So you ended up in Michigan. Just to
Mhm.
give people a sense, right? Michigan has a very particular place in the both the history and the present of political science. It sort of stands for something, right? Can you put, right, again, we talked a little bit about Stanford GSB and what it
Mhm.
sort of stood for. How would you differentiate Michigan from that? So our the people at, as they say, watching at home can get a sense of what the universe of things that people do is.
Yeah, so Michigan's complicated because it's a big place, much bigger than GSB. The GSB faculty is like 10 people, um, and the Michigan faculty is more like 50 people.
Yeah,
But if we
GSB
want to
is like
talk
a
about,
boutique.
yes, if we want to talk though about like general tendencies, Michigan's big claim to fame is that it was the first place that we really figured out the power of big national surveys to answer questions about what people think about politics and how people think about politics. In the middle of the 20th century, these big surveys led us to overturning a lot of the conventional wisdom about how people decide how to vote. More recently, we focus that attention more and more on answering questions about um, how race and racial attitudes play into American politics.
Right. So now again in the right, so there's always been a bunch of people who are doing what people call political behavior, right? Which is
Mm.
oddly enough, because it's not really about behavior. People always get confused
No, it's about what
about
people
why
think.
what?
Half the time, it's about what people think, not what they
Right. It's
do.
about
Yeah.
what people think, and then to some degree about people's voting choice, and that's sort of what political behavior is. But you study, institutions. So we often think of institutions and behavior. Those are sort of very different parts of the field, right?
Yeah.
So what's it like to be an institutionalist at a department that, at least historically, has been most differentiated by behavior?
There are some challenges for sure. So one of the big challenges is graduate student recruiting. When you're talking to people who are thinking about where to go to graduate school, and you have people who study institutions who really want, it's always a challenge to convince them that, hey, Michigan is not just this place that you can go to study political behavior. It's a cool place to come do what I want to do. Hiring can be a bit of a challenge, but one thing that I've liked about Michigan, and that's helped me to fit in better there than I think I otherwise would have, is because my institution's research really has this behavioral flair. Because a lot of what I'm doing is taking insights from evolutionary psychology and neuroscience and behavioral economics and applying them to the study of political institutions. They could see, okay, like, we might prefer to do political behavior, but we got to have people who study institutions, and this is our guy. This is somebody who thinks about this in a way that we can recognize as valuable and original and maybe even moving things a little bit in our preferred direction.
Yeah, and just want to say one thing about, again, just about our discipline. I always tell people that political science is a magpie discipline, right? So
Hmm.
magpies are these birds that are always out like looking for shiny things. So they like famously like steal people's keys and stuff. And political science has always been that way, right? There was a period when political scientists were magpies out there stealing stuff from like, anthropology. So if you go back and read Congress stuff from like the 50s and 60s, they're
Mhm.
all thinking about Congress as like very much like, people, in a like primitive culture, where they were
Yeah.
because they were out there stealing stuff from anthropology. And at some point they start like stealing stuff from, psychology and other disciplines. Then later on, right, rational choice people start stealing stuff from economics in particular, and later on, right, as people start going into, experiments, they're stealing from other parts of science. And one of the things in the way that's nice about political science is we don't actually historically have a core like that, right? We're always going to other disciplines because we're sort of defined by the thing we study, as
Yeah,
opposed to
exactly.
defined by like a way of analyzing things. Like sociology has people who are defined by that, and they apply it into lots of different stuff. And that's one of the good things about it. But I mean, how would you differentiate, as we're kind of getting near the end here? How would you differentiate the things that were sort of exciting when you were in grad school from the kind of things that are at the cutting edge of what people are being taught in graduate school now and the people who are going onto the market?
That's a tough question to answer because maybe I'm too young. I don't feel the field has overtaken the things that I thought were new and exciting. I think these are still very much so just to reiterate, what I find new and exciting. We've understood for a really long time that if you want to understand political institutions and how they operate, you need to know a lot about human nature. And it turns out that there are lots of things that we've learned about human nature from all across the social sciences and biology that were not known to the founding fathers or that were not known to Locke and Hobbes. And what I'm trying to do is incorporate those insights, largely from biology and biology adjacent fields, into the study of politics to say, okay, how should this update our understanding of how institutions work? Now that we know a little bit more about how human beings are actually wired and what human nature actually is. I think one of the challenges is that it's not so much that people think that that's wrong, as that a lot of graduate training today is not focused around any sort of theoretical first principles or guideposts whatsoever. Instead, it's driven more and more like economics by the way that we study things. All right, so we teach a particular set of technical tools for trying to tease out cause and effect relationships from data that are not experiments, from just the natural world. And that's really important. That's a big part of what I do. And I think it's good that we're training students in how to do this. But we've started to slack a little bit on talking about what are the questions that are really important to ask and how do we put the answers together into a body of knowledge that we can then go explain to other people. It's become more and more about kind of collecting little facts about how the world works, or sometimes, big facts about how the world works, but not thinking so much about how to synthesize them together. We're a discipline that has, I think, de-emphasized theory in the interests of pursuing ever greater empirical rigor. And a lot, there are some people who would argue that this is a bad thing. I don't think it's a bad thing that we prize empirical rigor. I just think that we also ought to care about theoretical integration too.
Yeah, and just really quickly before I get the last question, which is more specifically about Congress. I mean, that's my sense again is that, part of it is just having been in this racket for a very long time now, right? I've seen a bunch of waves of stuff that people at the time all thought was going to take over everything, but it turns out they're negative feedback mechanisms, right? Like people like start like running dry on really fantastic new insights with whatever the dominant paradigm is, right? And as you were saying, there's a lot, I've seen lots of job talks recently, and there's a lot of job talks where people they have an incredibly well identified finding, and it's
Mhm.
unclear what that adds into, right? What is the general aggregate set of questions or insights that thing is working toward. And again, now that I'm complimenting you, right? One of the things I found exciting about your work is in some sense, right, you're very new school in that you've got all of those tools, but a lot of the questions you're asking are like those questions about Congress that the OG Congress scholars, starting with Mayhew, were asking, right? Fundamental questions about how an institution operates as an overall system, right? And I think if I was predicting where the field is going to go, is that it's going to start rewarding people who are putting those sort of very precise measurement and identification questions at the disposal of some of those more larger theoretical models about how systems operate. We're going to go back to some kind of unification of that. Does that seem like a reason? I mean, it's all predictions, so we know nobody knows. But what's your thought?
Again, in terms of what's going to happen, I don't know.
Yeah.
But in terms of what I would like to see happen, that's definitely what I'd like to see happen.
Yeah, so just specifically in Congress, right? So when we talked a little bit about, right, where the field has gone, what do you think are the questions, especially in your specific field in Congress, that are likely to be, the things we're going to be talking about over the next decade, right? And how much of those are just from normal science, and how much of that is that the actual institution is changing and it's forcing us to think about it in new ways?
I think we're going to change the big question that's motivating all the research. So if you look at how research has looked over last 15, 20 years, the implicit question that drives research is why is Congress so dysfunctional? Why is Congress failing to complete the basic tasks that are required of it for a functioning constitutional order? And we've come up with answers that are too good in the sense that it seems like there's a lot of incentives for Congress to fail to uphold the separation of powers and checks and balances, or to fail to articulate and then deliver real solutions to difficult and divisive policy problems. And so I think the pendulum is going to swing the other way, and we're going to start asking more and more, why does Congress ever do the things that we think Congress ought to be doing? How is it that Congress was ever able to stand up to the presidency, or was ever able to consistently solve problems on a bipartisan basis with rotating coalitions of exactly who was in and who was out, or ever focused on legislative work to the exclusion of electioneering? That's the interesting question. And
Yeah,
I
and that's
think,
where I know we're
yeah,
both big fans of Francis Lee, and
yes.
I think of that as a very Francis Lee question. So again, and this some people may have seen this in the popular thing. Matt Iglesias always talks about the idea of the secret Congress, right? The idea that there's a Congress we all see on TV and people yelling at each other and calling each other names and seeming to only do things on partisan lines, and yet we can name a bunch of legislation that seem to be done through strange bedfellows, coalitions on the DL. And so, part of the question is, well, why does any of that occur in a period that's simultaneously with so much polarization, right?
Mhm.
And at least in my view, one of the things is, when we're only focusing on dysfunction, that means we're often not seeing at least some of the kernel of better function in the actual institution now. And then the question is, how do we get more of that thing this institution still seems like it's got some capacity to do? All right. And again, that's one where I do think, there's a kind of, I'll just put it this way. One thing that's different about us than other sciences is we care about the thing we're studying, right?
Mhm.
We want it to survive, right? We have a liberal democratic order. We want it to survive. We're not like ambivalent as to whether like, it just gets eaten up or whatever, right? And I think that's going to be one of the things, not just in Congress, but I think in a lot of other things that people are going to start trying to do more of trying to see at least, especially even in the period that seems to me as dark as it is, right? We can see lots of indications of things that might actually become the kernel of something bigger later on. And so that's just a little bit of my pitch for why to study this, right? Is that some of the people who may be listening to this call may have had a more humanities-ish background. They read Hobbes and Locke and they wanted to do more of it. I actually started out as a political theorist, and then decided I would never be more than like a B minus political theorist. And literally, the last thing the world needs is a B minus political theorist. But that you can actually ask a lot of those fairly fundamental questions, right? Questions about what's the nature of a regime? How do you make it work? How do you make liberal democracy work, right? You can do that with the more advanced techniques that are being developed in lots of political science. And at least one of my, so there's two stories I could tell out of you. One is people who already have a lot of that background in mathematical ability can do a lot of incredibly interesting things, right, in political science. But it's also people who've already got a lot of training in some of those fundamental conceptual, historical, theoretical things. There's a lot of things you can do with some of the techniques that you've developed to actually advance some of those questions, even questions you were saying as fundamental as like what is human nature and how does human nature shape political institutions. So, okay, you got one final thing if you need advice for the people who are thinking they might go into the graduate school in the future, especially people who are maybe a little more ideologically heterodox. What advice might you have for them as they're thinking about going into a career in this field?
This is very top of mind because I'm on University of Michigan's admissions committee this year. This is the first time I've done this, so I just have the experience of sorting through the all the people who apply and trying to figure out what gets you to stand out. Uh, I really think that for the top programs, some significant evidence of technical competence is a basic prerequisite for getting through the door for most people. Um, and so, getting a good quant score on the GRE would be like the minimum, but if you can take technical classes and do well in them, that just makes it so much easier to advance your application to the next stage. And obviously, more is always better. The more technical you are, the easier it's going to be. I wondered, when I was in college, I literally took zero substantive political science classes before I applied for my PhD, and then I said, "Hey, is this going to be a problem?" No. So there's no such thing as too much technical training, but a little is a heck of a lot better than none at all. Um, and then once you're there, this is the story I never quite got to tell about recruiting in politics. Recruiting in academia works in much the same way. Strong letters of recommendation from people who have worked with you closely on research projects are the difference between a successful application and not. And so, if you are at a research institution where you have faculty members who are doing political science research, who people on the admissions committee might know or have heard of, working with them on something and having them vouch for your ability to do this job and your knowledge of what you're getting yourself into by doing a political science PhD is huge. If you are not at one of those institutions, that's okay. But the central challenge you should be trying to resolve in your path to graduate school is how do you get that opportunity to work with somebody on research? And one nice thing is that we're seeing more and more predoctoral programs opening up to give people who don't come from that background the opportunity to try it out. Originally, a lot of those were run on like race and ethnic and identity lines, but we're seeing more of them now who are open up to anyone who wants to do them. And so, if that's you, that would be something I would take a real close look at.
Yeah, I have one of my best students is just finishing up one at Dartmouth, and it's a great opportunity for doing that. And again, this is the last thing I'll say, just by way of advice, is it's important to have a model of what you think an admissions committee is looking for, right? Always shocked at how few people seem to have one when they're writing their letters or putting their materials together, right? And again, one of the things I think is, right, they really don't want someone who's going to wash out and not do well and they're going to be stuck with for 5 years, right?
Mhm.
Really, that like, there's nothing worse than having somebody who has gotten there, either turns out they can't do the technical work or doesn't have any interesting questions or doesn't have the like aptitude for sort of, hard, often unrewarding work, right? So it is important to try and, get as much information as you can about, what it is that people like what you're doing, like what is Christian Fong optimizing for, right?
Mhm.
And because that's going to determine whether they look at your application, say this looks promising, or they look at your application, say this person's not going to get past the first year. So, okay, we should let you go because I know you clearly have a thing where you're such an impressive guy. You're doing two jobs. You're grinding it as a political scientist, and you're parenting. So I want to thank you on behalf of GSI IDI for helping us out. Christian is one of the mentors who's helping out with our program, who you might get matched with if you have interest in any of the subjects that we've talked about so far. I'll hand this on to Jacob to lead us out. But thank you so much, Christian.
Thanks, Steve.
Just a brief note again of thanks to Christian, and we'll see you on, I think, 3 or 4 more of these calls or recordings for students who are interested. So keep a lookout for future postings if you're getting to this one first.
All
Thanks
right.
again.
Thank you very much.